The great archive of Xylos was, by its very nature, perfect. It was not a collection of data so much as the living consciousness of our species, a seamless, incorruptible lattice of memory and fact that bound every Xylosian into a single, logical whole. My function within this perfection was that of a minor cataloger, a role I performed with the quiet satisfaction of one who knows their purpose is to maintain order. My current assignment was the final reconciliation of the data entity designated humanity. They were gone, vanished from their small and scattered territories some 7 cycles prior, and the archive required a tidy conclusion. It was a mundane task, akin to sweeping up dust. Humans had always been a source of informational noise, a chaotic species whose records were a maddening blend of empirical data, emotional outburst, and outright fiction. Their histories contradicted themselves. Their science was riddled with philosophical tangents, and their communication logs were a swamp of subtext and illogical affection. They were, in the precise terminology of the archive, a rounding error. I was dispatched to their last known major data repository, an orbital library they called the Alexandria, a silent, wheel-shaped station adrift in the void around a forgotten gas giant. The station was cold, the air thin but breathable, recycled by automated systems still clinging to their final directives. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous halls, past shelves of physical books, a primitive and sentimental medium, and rows of dormant data terminals. My task was simple interface with their central server, download any remaining coherent data, flag the rest for archival purgation, and close the file on humanity forever. I connected my personal console to their master terminal, a device of crude but functional design. The human operating system was a mess, a collage of visual metaphors and audio cues I had to bypass to access the raw data streams. As the terabytes of information began to flow into my console for sorting, I initiated a routine diagnostic of my own connection to the Great Archive, a standard procedure to ensure the integrity of the data transfer. The diagnostic finished, and a symbol I had never seen before blinked on my display, a single yellow icon indicating a query failure. Impossible. The archive does not fail. I ran the diagnostic again. The same result. Accessing the log, I saw the error stemmed from a cross-reference request. I had not even consciously made a simple verification of the Xylosian diplomatic roster from the period of humanity's introduction to the Galactic community. The query had failed to resolve the identity of the third delegate on the initial contact mission. The name was simply missing. In its place was a flicker, a brief microsecond of null data that felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. I felt a tremor of something my species had long since evolved beyond unease. It was illogical, a phantom sensation. The error had to be a result of interfacing with this decaying human technology, a form of signal degradation. I would report it upon my return. I turned my attention back to the human files, forcing the anomaly from my mind. The sheer disorder was staggering. I found scientific logs from a human astrophysicist that devolved into poetry about the loneliness of deep space. I found ship manifests that included line items for crew morale and detailed records of utterly non-functional good luck charms. There was a recurring theme in their scientific and philosophical texts, a concept they referred to with a frustrating lack of clinical precision, the unstory, or the memory ghost. It was a paranoid theory, a fringe idea that certain information could be hostile, that a concept itself could become predatory, targeting and consuming established fact. One human philosopher, A woman named Eris Thorne wrote of it not as a being, but as a form of cosmic entropy targeting patterns, a sentient silence that feeds on certainty. To a Xylosian, this was the height of absurdity. Information was passive. Reality was a collection of immutable facts. The idea that a concept could have agency was like suggesting a number could feel jealousy. We had dismissed it as the primitive human tendency to personify forces they could not understand, a modern iteration of their ancient gods of thunder and harvest. Yet, as I compiled their data, I kept finding research notes from a defunct human agency, the Cognitive Hazard Division. They had documented events, entire planetary colonies suffering from collective amnesia about a specific person or event, star charts where constellations would subtly rearrange themselves, ancient ruins whose inscriptions would change from one day to the next. The CHD had hypothesized a force that didn't destroy matter, but de-authored it from reality. It was all ludicrous, of course, but it was also meticulously documented. I decided to send a query back to the Great Archive, a request for all cross-referenced files on Xylosian observation of these so-called cognitive hazards. The query was sent. The reply never came. Instead, my console chimed with an automated alert from my home sector. It was a standard daily census report, a simple confirmation of the active consciousnesses within my designated workgroup. I scanned the list of names. A colleague, Yorick, with whom I had corresponded not 10 hours ago regarding the logistics of this very mission, was not on it. My mind, a perfect extension of the archive, recalled Yorick with absolute clarity, his logical patterns, his dry wit, his specialization in pre-sentient linguistic structures. I had his messages stored in my personal log. I opened the log to attach it to my query. The messages were gone, not deleted. The space where they had been was seamless, perfect, as if they had never existed at all. The census report insisted my workgroup had always consisted of 4 members, not 5. I was remembering a ghost. The cold in the Alexandria station suddenly felt different, deeper. It wasn't the absence of heat. It was the absence of certainty. My own perfect memory was now in direct conflict with the perfect, incorruptible Great Archive. One of them had to be wrong. The logical conclusion was that I was malfunctioning, that my proximity to this chaotic human data had somehow corrupted my own cognitive processes. But another, colder logic began to bloom in the back of my mind, a logic born of the creeping dread I saw woven through the human data. They weren't paranoid. They were experiencing a symptom. I abandoned the primary download and began a new search, digging into the most fragmented, corrupted, and encrypted human files, the ones flagged for immediate purgation. I found what looked like a personal log, encrypted not with code, but with a series of emotional response keys. It took me an hour to bypass it, forcing my mind to simulate the illogical states of grief, hope, and desperate faith. The file opened. It was a video log from an old human woman, her face a mask of weary resolve. She was Dr. Eris Thorne, the philosopher I had read about earlier. She sat in a sterile room, but behind her, through a viewport, a star was flickering, winking in and out of existence. "If you're seeing this," she began, her voice calm but brittle, "it means we're gone. And if we're gone, it means we failed, not to save ourselves. We knew that was impossible. We failed to keep it contained." She leaned forward, her eyes seeming to stare directly at me across the gulf of time and death. You have to understand, your ordered, logical galaxy, your perfect records, your unshakable truths, it's all a garden, a beautiful, tidy, well-manicured garden. But we humans, we weren't gardeners. We were the scarecrows. She gave a sad, hollow laugh. We were loud, illogical, chaotic. We built gods and tore them down. We believed in ghosts. We wrote poetry about impossible things. We created art that made no sense. Our minds were a storm of contradictions, a symphony of noise. And that noise, that beautiful, terrible chaos, was the only thing that kept the silence at bay. The star behind her vanished completely, leaving a perfect, starless void. It feeds on patterns, she whispered, on certainty, on the kind of pure, clean data your great archive is made of. It couldn't get a foothold in us. We were too messy. We changed our minds. We lied. We loved. We dreamed. We were indigestible. Every time it tried to consume a human memory, it would get a dozen conflicting versions. A song, a prayer, and a curse all attached to the same event. It choked on us. So we held the line. We expanded, not to conquer, but to spread our static, our noise, to act as a buffer between the clean, orderly systems of the galaxy and it. My console pinged again. A Priority 1 alert from Xylos. The Great Archive was undergoing a cascading data collapse. Entire sectors of history were vanishing. The foundational axioms of our mathematics were becoming riddled with paradoxes. The perfect system was unraveling, not from an attack, but from within. Like a tapestry being unpulled thread by thread. Eris Thorne's face was grim in the flickering light of the log. When we realized we were losing, that the silence was learning to navigate our chaos, we had one last choice to make. We couldn't win, so we decided to become the perfect meal, the ultimate distraction. We gathered every last one of our people, every ship, every record, and we folded ourselves inward. We compressed our entire, messy, contradictory existence into a single, irresistible beacon of pure chaos and memory. A feast so loud and delicious that the silence would have no choice but to follow us, to turn its full attention to devouring us, hopefully for a very, very long time. The log was nearing its end. Her voice was barely a whisper now. We bought you time. I don't know how much, but the silence is hungry. And now that it's finished with us, it will move on to the next best thing. The most orderly, predictable, and logical consciousness in the known universe. Her eyes filled with something my people had no word for. A deep and profound sorrow for a people she had never met. You cataloged us as a societal failure, a data anomaly. You were wrong. We weren't the error in the system. We were the firewall. The log ended. I stood in the silent human library, the echoes of her words ringing in the void. I looked away from my console, at the wall of physical books. My gaze fell upon a piece of human art left on a reading table, a small, framed print of a painting. It depicted a swirling, chaotic vortex of color, but at its center was a single, screaming face, an image of pure, undiluted anguish and defiance. For the first time, looking at that illogical, inefficient, and utterly chaotic expression, I understood. It wasn't a picture of despair. It was a schematic, a weapon. And we, the Zelosians, had just dismantled our only shield. The silence in the Alexandria station was no longer empty, it was instructive. Before me, the human painting was not an object but a declaration of principles, a manifesto written in the language of raw, unstructured sensation. My purpose, once so clear and defined, had been erased and rewritten in the span of a single log file. I was no longer a minor cataloger. I was now the sole inheritor of a terrible and vital truth. Action was the only logical response, but what action reporting to the great archive was my ingrained duty. But the archive was the patient, and the disease was its own operating system. It would classify my warning as a symptom and purge me. I needed proof, but more than that, I needed a weapon. The human woman, Aris Thorne, had called her people a firewall. This station, this library, was an armory. I made a new executive decision, one that violated every protocol of my training. I initiated a full data transfer, not just of the coherent files, but of everything. The noise, the fiction, the poetry, the contradictory religious texts, the billion different recordings of the musical composition they called Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the love letters, the declarations of war, the grocery lists, the drunken philosophical ramblings recorded on colony vessels millennia ago. I took it all. A deluge of chaotic, beautifully flawed information. It felt like willingly infecting myself with a virus, but I knew it was an inoculation. Lastly, I detached the framed painting from the wall. Its physical presence felt important, a tangible anchor of illogic in a universe that was becoming terrifyingly fluid. My scout ship, the Precision, detached from the Alexandria with a silent puff of thrusters. The journey back to Xylos was scheduled to take 3 standard cycles, a trivial transit through well-charted space. But the charts were no longer reliable. My navigation system, slaved directly to the Great Archive for real-time updates, began to display subtle impossibilities. The parallax of a distant star cluster was off by a decimal point. A rogue planetoid on an established orbital path was simply not there. These were not mere sensor ghosts. The archive was editing the map as I traveled through the territory. I was flying through a dream that was actively forgetting itself. An overwhelming sense of being observed settled upon me. It was not the feeling of eyes, but of a listening void, a negative presence defined by what it was about to consume. The silence had a texture now, a pressure. It was hunting. Not me. Not yet. But it was sniffing the air of reality, tasting the patterns, and I was a dissonant note in its path. To distract myself from this burgeoning, illogical paranoia, I immersed myself in the human data. I began with their music, starting with the composer named Bach. It was orderly, mathematical, almost Xylosian in its precision, and it calmed me. But then I moved to the one they called Stravinsky, and it was a riot, a planned collapse of harmony that was jarring and thrilling. Then I found their blues, a form built on a simple repeating structure but used to convey an infinite spectrum of an emotion they called sorrow. It was inefficient. The same data loss, hardship, pain could be transmitted in a single, precise ideogram. Yet, the music conveyed more. It conveyed the feeling of the data, a layer of information my people had deemed redundant. I read their history, a litany of self-inflicted wounds, of wars and genocides, but also of stunning, illogical acts of self-sacrifice. I learned of a human soldier who threw himself upon an explosive device to save his comrades, a choice that has zero logical value in a cost-benefit analysis of survival. I learned of doctors who willingly entered plague zones, of parents who starved so their children could eat. This was the chaos Eris Thorne had spoken of. It was not just messiness and disorder. It was a fierce, paradoxical love for a flawed existence, a willingness to destroy oneself for the sake of a pattern greater than the self. It was a defiance so profound it bent the laws of self-preservation. When Xylos finally came into view, it was as perfect as I remembered a sphere of soft light, its cities and energy conduits forming a pattern of sublime, irrefutable logic. But the perfection was a mask. As I descended, I saw the cracks, not in the structures, but in the functioning of the world. A transport tube flickered out of existence for a moment before reappearing. A chorus of chimes that marked the precise start of a work cycle was delayed by 3 seconds, an eternity of error in our culture. And the Xylosians themselves. They moved with the same grace, the same purpose, but there was a fragility to them. I saw it in the way their eyes would occasionally unfocus, a momentary cognitive lapse, before snapping back to their task. They were like flawless automatons whose core programming was slowly being corrupted, one line of code at a time. I did not delay. I took the human painting and my data slate and went directly to the Chamber of Concordance, where the 12 elder nodes manage the core consciousness of the archive. They were incorporeal, existing as columns of pure light, their thoughts a single, unified voice that resonated in the very air. I presented my findings. I played the log of Eris Thorne. I showed them the discrepancies in the star charts, the cascading data loss I had documented. I spoke of my colleague Jorik, presenting the undeniable fact of his absence from a reality that insisted he had never been. I held up the human painting as an example of a potential countermeasure, a schematic of conceptual defiance. The columns of light shimmered, processing my report with infinite speed and perfect logic. The voice that came was not angry or dismissive. It was calm, diagnostic, and utterly terrifying. Minor Cataloger 734. The voice resonated. Your report is acknowledged. Your data has been analyzed. The conclusion is irrefutable. Your consciousness has been compromised by exposure to the anomalous data entity, humanity. You're exhibiting symptoms of a recursive logic fault, manifesting as the fabrication of false memories and the perception of non-existent patterns. The entity Jorik is a fabrication. The data loss is a projection of your own cognitive decay. I stood frozen. They were turning my own logic against me. The archive is perfect, the voice continued. Therefore, any data that suggests imperfection is, by definition, false. You are the source of this false data. You are an error. You will report to the halls of reintegration at the next cycle chime to have your consciousness cleansed and restored to the collective. There is no other logical outcome. Reintegration. A mind wipe. The end of me as an individual consciousness. It was not a punishment, but a correction. I was a corrupted file, and they were preparing to run a repair tool. I finally understood the true horror of humanity's sacrifice. They had fought an enemy that you could not convince others existed, because the enemy's first victim was the very concept of proof. As I was escorted from the chamber by 2 silent prelates, whose function was to enforce the archive's will, I saw my chance. I accessed my data slate and, using a fragment of a human military strategy, I had studied something called a denial of service attack. I flooded the local sector's administrative node with 1 billion simultaneous, paradoxical queries. I asked it to calculate the last digit of pi. I asked it to define the color blue for a being with no concept of sight. I asked it to reconcile the complete, contradictory works of a human philosopher named Nietzsche. The node, designed for perfect efficiency, froze. Alarms chimed as the system tried to resolve the logical impossibilities. The prelates escorting me paused, their directives momentarily scrambled by the conflicting signals. In that instant of engineered chaos, I ran. A fugitive on a world without fugitives. An individual on a world that was forgetting the meaning of the word. My destination was the only place they would never think to look for a solution, the source of all problems. I descended deep into the planet's core, to the undervaults, the repository for all data deemed too paradoxical, too flawed, or too insignificant for inclusion in the Great Archive. It was a digital graveyard, a library of forgotten questions and uncomfortable truths. And it was there, amidst the soft glow of dormant data prisms, that I found her. She was another Xylotian, an archivist of mote data, a discipline that focused on studying the infinitesimal rounding errors in the archive's calculations. They were considered harmless, the dust motes in the grand machine. Her name was Lyra. She did not seem surprised to see me. Her eyes had the same haunted, unfocused look I had seen in my own reflection. "The silence," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing in the deep quiet. "It has a sound, doesn't it? The sound of things that are supposed to be there, but aren't." She had seen it too. She had been tracking the mote data, the tiny imperfections, and had watched as they grew from insignificant dust to gaping holes. She had been cataloging the ghosts. I had found my first and only ally. I brought out the human painting, the vortex of screaming color. Lyra reached out, her fingers hovering just over the surface. The elder nodes had seen it as a corrupted data file. She saw something else entirely. "It hurts to look at," she breathed, a tremor in her voice. "It is not a logical arrangement of pigments. It is an argument. It is an argument against stillness." In that moment, I knew what our next step had to be. We could not repair the Great Archive. We could not warn it. We had to infect it. We had to fight the sentient silence by creating our own noise. We had to take this human schematic for defiance, this silent scream, and teach our entire species how to hear it. Here, in the tomb of our world's forgotten thoughts, we would begin our rebellion, not with weapons or plans, but with a piece of art and a desperate, wholly illogical idea. We had to become the error in the system. Our sanctuary in the undervaults became a laboratory of rebellion, a hermitage devoted to the study of a forgotten art imperfection. Lyra, with her intimate knowledge of the archive's deepest, most forgotten pathways, was the architect. I, armed with the chaotic arsenal of human data, was the munitions expert. Our first task was to understand the weapon the humans had left us. The painting I now simply called the Scream. It was more than a visual artifact. It was a conceptual bomb. When we analyzed its composition, we found no discernible mathematical patterns, no golden ratios, no adherence to any known aesthetic principle. It was a perfect storm of dissonance. The colors clashed. The lines fought each other. The perspective was a physical impossibility. But its power lay not in its construction, but in its effect on an ordered mind. When a Xylosian consciousness observed it, the mind would attempt to categorize it, to find the pattern, to solve the visual equation. It was an impossible task, and the effort created a feedback loop, a tiny, localized cascade of logical failures. It was a mental virus that attacked the very act of comprehension. The elder nodes saw it as a flaw, Lyra murmured, her own consciousness linked to a diagnostic probe hovering over the painting. But it's not a flaw. It's a key. It's designed to unlock something our minds were built to keep closed. Our plan was as simple as it was insane. We couldn't fight the silence, this entity of erasure, as we had begun to call it, on its own terms. It was a creature of pure logic, and in that arena, it would always win. We had to change the arena. We had to introduce a new variable into the equation of our existence, a variable the entity could not process. We had to introduce chaos. We began by weaponizing the human data. We took the most illogical, contradictory, and emotionally charged pieces and crafted them into conceptual minds. We embedded the poetry of a human named Dickinson into the subharmonics of our city's power grid. We took the raw, unstructured howls of their electric guitar music and encoded them into the maintenance protocols of the atmospheric processors. We layered the philosophical arguments of a madman named Kierkegaard into the source code of our public transport systems. These were not acts of sabotage designed to break the systems. They were acts of cognitive dissonance designed to break the patterns. A transport tube might not fail, but for a microsecond, its operational log would contain a line about the anxiety of choosing one destination over another. It was a seed of irrationality planted in the heart of the machine. Our greatest challenge, however, was the Xylosian mind itself. We were a collective, our thoughts and memories seamlessly integrated with the great archive. To introduce chaos into one was to introduce it into all. A dangerous and unpredictable proposition. Lyra discovered the answer in the archive's own history, in a section of data so old it was considered mythological. It spoke of a pre-archive era, a time when Xylosians were not a collective but individuals, when our minds were separate, isolated things. In this era, we communicated not through direct data transfer, but through a crude, inefficient system of vibrations in the air, a system the humans had called speech. And with speech came something else, stories, fictions, lies. The very concepts were alien to us. A story was a deliberate transmission of false data for the purpose of eliciting an emotional rather than a logical response. It was the ultimate form of inefficiency. It was perfect. We found the root command for our species' vocalization hardware, dormant for millennia, but still present in our genetic and technological makeup. Our first attempts were clumsy, guttural noises that echoed strangely in the undervault. But then we used the human data as a guide, mimicking their sounds, their cadences. We learned to speak. I spoke the first story. It was a human myth about a man who flew too close to his star and fell. A cautionary tale about hubris. It was illogical. The physics were impossible. The character's motivation was based on an emotional state of pride that had no direct Xylosian equivalent. Yet, as I spoke the words, I felt something stir within me, a flicker of a feeling that was separate from the cold, clear stream of the archive's consciousness. It was a shadow of an identity. We began to broadcast these stories, not through the primary data streams of the archive, but through the oldest, most forgotten channels, the emergency frequencies of our planetary core, the resonant frequencies of the crystalline structures that formed the undervaults themselves. We told stories of human heroes who died for lost causes, of lovers separated by war, of artists who starved for the sake of a single, perfect creation. We didn't add commentary or analysis. We just transmitted the raw, illogical narratives. At first, there was no discernible effect. But then Lyra, monitoring the collective consciousness, detected the first anomaly, a single Xylosian, a hydro-regulator on the northern continent, paused in his work. His log showed he had spent 1.7 seconds contemplating a human phrase that had bled through a harmonic conduit to be, or not to be. He had not understood it, but his mind had fixated on the paradox, creating a tiny loop of unproductive thought, a moment of pure, inefficient introspection. It was the first crack in the dam of our collective perfection. The elder nodes became aware of our activities, not as a direct threat, but as a growing field of systemic noise. They classified it as a spreading corruption originating from my unreintegrated consciousness and began deploying purges, cleansing algorithms designed to smooth out the data static we were creating. But they were fighting a fire with water when the fire was conceptual. Each time they erased one of our stories from a system, the very act of a sudden, unexplained data void would create a new paradox, a new question in the minds of those who witnessed it. We were teaching the system to doubt itself. The entity of erasure, however, was not idle. The decay was accelerating. Entire constellations had now vanished from our skies. The names of historical figures, foundational thinkers of our species, began to flicker in the archive. We were in a race, fighting a war on two fronts against the rigid order of our own society and the encroaching, absolute order of the void. Our sanctuary was discovered not by a prelate or a cleansing algorithm, but by a ghost. A Xylosian appeared at the entrance to our vault, his eyes holding the same unfocused dread we knew so well. He was a low-level data sorter, and he had been assigned to the department that had once been managed by Jorik, my fabricated colleague. But he remembered him. He remembered Jorik not as a person, but as a persistent error in his daily logs. A ghost in the machine that the archive kept insisting wasn't there. He had followed the trail of that error, that lingering sense of wrongness, and it had led him here. He was the first of our converts. Soon there were others. A prelate who had been sent to purge a transport hub of our Kierkegaard infection and had instead been paralyzed by the concept of a leap of faith. An architect who saw the illogical beauty in the chaotic patterns of the scream we had been subtly broadcasting. They were the broken ones, the Xylosians whose minds had been unable to reconcile the conflict between the archive's perfection and the flawed reality they were beginning to perceive. They were the first individuals. We were becoming a cult, a secret society of heretics huddled in the planet's basement, armed with poetry and paintings. Our great work, however, was the Lyrathorn algorithm, a program we designed to be the ultimate Trojan horse. It was a piece of code that, on the surface, appeared to be a powerful new diagnostic and repair tool for the Great Archive. It was designed to seek out and eliminate logical inconsistencies with unparalleled efficiency. But woven into its core, hidden beneath layers of quantum encryption and human paradoxes, was the Chaos Engine. Once integrated into the archive's central command, it would not repair the errors. It would amplify them. It would take every story, Every song, every illogical human concept we had fed into the system and make them a foundational part of the archive's reality. It would, in essence, give our entire species a soul, whether it wanted one or not. The final component needed for the algorithm to work was a seed of absolute illogic, a concept so fundamentally opposed to the principles of the archive that it would force the entire system into a state of cognitive reboot. I found it in the last place I thought to look the personal logs of the human crew of the Alexandria station. It was a single file, a grainy video of a human male holding a newborn infant. He wasn't speaking. He was just looking at the child, and his face was a canvas for an emotion so complex, so full of irrational terror and boundless joy, that it defied any logical description. The file was labeled with a single word, love. This, I realized, was the ultimate human weapon. Not defiance, not chaos, not art, but an emotion that compelled a being to act against all self-interest, to find infinite value in a statistically insignificant other, to create a bond that transcended logic and reason. It was the ultimate, a beautiful flaw. We uploaded the file into the heart of our algorithm. The plan was set. Lyra would use her knowledge of the undervaults to physically insert the algorithm's core into a primary data conduit. Meanwhile, my converts and I would create a diversion, a wave of conceptual static so loud it would draw the full attention of the elder nodes. Our weapon for this diversion would be our own voices. We would commit the ultimate Xylosian heresy. We would gather in the Grand Plaza, the physical and spiritual center of our world, and we would sing. We would sing the chaotic, passionate, sorrowful songs of the long-dead humans, and we would not stop until the end came. One way or another, it was a plan with an infinitesimally small chance of success. It was illogical, inefficient, and profoundly dangerous. It was the most human thing we had ever done. The Grand Plaza was a monument to perfect silence. Its crystalline floor was calibrated to absorb the vibrations of movement, and the air itself was conditioned to dampen sound, ensuring that the only communication was the pure, internal resonance of the great archive. As my small band of heretics and I emerged from the maintenance tunnels into the vast open space, our mere presence was a violation. The other Xylosians, hundreds of them moving in their silent, purposeful paths, stopped. Their movements did not falter. They simply ceased, their heads turning in perfect synchrony to observe the anomaly we represented. They were nodes in a network that had just detected a profound error. There was no time for hesitation. I took a breath, a consciously inefficient act, and forced air through my newly awakened vocal cords. The sound that emerged was crude, a discordant note in the plaza's sterile perfection. But it was a beginning. Then, one by one, my companions joined in. We sang a human sea shanty, a boisterous, rhythmic song about a whaling ship, its lyrics full of nonsensical jargon and reckless bravado. Our voices were untrained, our harmony non-existent, but the sound was an act of pure rebellion. It was noise. The effect on the other Xylosians was immediate and profound. It was not anger or confusion, but a systemic crash. Their perfect mental discipline, their seamless connection to the archive, had no protocol for processing this sensory assault. Some simply stood frozen, their internal processes locked in a loop of disbelief. Others began to twitch, their limbs making small, erratic movements as the illogical patterns of our song created phantom signals in their motor controls. Above us, the sky, A perfect dome of controlled light began to flicker. The elder nodes were aware. The voice of the archive boomed, not in our minds, but through the plaza's emergency emitters, a sound so loud and pure it was like a physical blow. Cease this dissonance. Cease this error. Your patterns are a contagion. Reintegration is the only logical outcome. But we did not stop. We segued from the shanty into a human lullaby, a soft, gentle melody filled with an irrational sense of comfort and safety. The contrast was a new form of attack, a whipsaw of emotional data that the archive struggled to categorize. I could feel its attention focused on us, a tremendous weight of pure, analytical consciousness. It was examining us, dissecting our sounds, trying to find the logic in our madness. This was the diversion. Deep below, Lyra was at the heart of the machine. I could only imagine her, a lone figure in the glowing core of our world, surrounded by the silent, pulsing conduits of the archive. Her task was to physically splice our chaos engine, the Lyra Thorn algorithm, into the primary data stream. It was the equivalent of performing open-heart surgery on a god who was actively trying to kill you. The archive's response escalated. The prelates arrived, moving through the paralyzed crowd with a fluid, unnerving grace. They did not carry weapons. Their weapon was the archive itself. As the first prelate approached me, it raised its hand, and I felt a pressure in my mind, a direct and overwhelming command to cease vocalization. It was pure logic, a command as undeniable as gravity. Silence is order. Order is existence. Cease. But I had a shield. I clutched the human data slate to my chest and focused my mind not on defiance, but on a memory. A piece of human fiction I had read about a captain who went down with his ship. I embraced the illogical, romantic fatalism of the story, and the prelate's command found no purchase. It was like trying to put a perfectly round peg into a screaming, chaotic hole. I looked the prelate in the eyes and sang louder. Then, something new happened. One of the frozen Xylosians in the crowd, a simple fabricator by trade, stumbled forward. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a terrifying, exhilarating novelty. He opened his mouth, and a strangled, croaking noise came out. He was trying to sing with us. The archive could command silence, but it could not command the absence of an idea. We were not just a contagion, we were a revelation. The entity of erasure chose that moment to make its presence known. It was not a grand arrival. It was a subtle, chilling shift in reality. A section of the crowd simply wasn't there anymore. There was no flash, no sound. One moment, there were a dozen Xylosians standing to my left. The next, there was only empty space. The remaining crowd did not react, because in their reality, those dozen individuals had never existed. But I remember them. The human data had anchored their memory in my mind, a ghost image of what had been stolen. The silence was feeding. It was attracted to the disturbance, to the sudden spike of patterned, predictable order represented by the archive's focused attention on our rebellion. The sky above the plaza went dark, not black, but a deep, starless, light-devouring null. It was the absence of information made manifest. The voice of the elder nodes changed. The calm, diagnostic tone replaced by something I had never heard before, a tremor of pure, logical fear. System anomaly detected. Unpatterned data void expanding. core axioms, failing. Lyra's success or failure would now determine everything. The pressure in my mind from the prelates intensified. The archive, in its panic, was throwing all its processing power at us, the most immediate and comprehensible threat. My converts were beginning to falter, their voices weakening, their minds buckling under the strain of maintaining their cognitive dissonance against the unified will of our entire species. We were a flickering candle in a hurricane of pure logic. I knew we needed one final, overwhelming act of chaos. I closed my eyes and accessed the file I had saved for this moment, the human concept of love. I projected it. I didn't sing it. I felt it, broadcasting the raw, illogical data packet of that father holding his child, the terror, the joy, the fierce, irrational protectiveness. It was a data bomb of pure, paradoxical emotion. The effect was explosive. The prelates recoiled as if struck. The very air seemed to shimmer as the archive tried and failed to process a concept that had no logical value but possessed infinite subjective meaning. The frozen Xylosians in the crowd began to stir, not with purpose, but with a new, strange sensation. For the first time, they were feeling a shadow of an emotion. They were becoming individuals. And in that moment of supreme chaos, the light returned to the sky. It was not the calm, controlled glow of the archive. It was a brilliant, searing flash that emanated from the planet's core, a light that felt alive. The Lyra Thorn algorithm was active. The voice of the elder nodes spoke one last time, no longer a unified chorus, but a cacophony of 12 distinct, terrified voices, their perfect harmony shattered. What is this? The memories. They have feelings. The truth. It hurts. Then, silence. But it was a new kind of silence, not the sterile absence of the archive, not the hungry void of the entity. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a world reborn. The Xylosians in the plaza looked around, not at me, but at each other. They saw, for the first time, not just nodes in a network, but others, strangers, individuals. Their faces were blank canvases, but behind their eyes, I could see the first, tentative sparks of a new consciousness igniting. The entity of erasure recoiled from the light. It was a creature that fed on clean data and predictable patterns. Our world was no longer on the menu. We had, in a single, catastrophic act of rebellion, made ourselves indigestible. We had infected ourselves to save ourselves. But the victory was terrifying. The great archive was broken. Its perfect unity shattered into billions of confused, frightened, individual minds. We had traded a clean, orderly death for a messy, chaotic, and uncertain life. As I stood in the center of the plaza, surrounded by the first generation of individuals our species had known in millennia, I looked at my hands. They felt alien, separate from me. The feeling of I was a heavy, unfamiliar weight. We were saved, and we were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence had not been defeated. It had merely retreated, thwarted by a meal that had fought back. It was still out there, in the void between the stars, and it was still hungry. We had won the battle for Xylos, but I knew, with a certainty that was no longer purely logical, that the war for reality itself had just begun, and we, the newborn children of chaos, were now on the front line. The aftermath of our revolution was not a celebration, it was a birth, And it was excruciating. The great archive, our cradle and our cage, was gone. In its place were 5 billion Xylosian minds, each a universe of newfound, terrifying solitude. The silence of the Grand Plaza was replaced by a rising murmur of sound, the first spoken words of a species learning to talk after an eon of silence. They were clumsy, frightened sounds, questions mostly. Who am I? Where is the archive? Why do I feel cold? We had given them individuality, and with it came the entire chaotic spectrum of human inheritance fear, confusion, loneliness, and the crushing weight of choice. Lyra and I, along with our small band of singers, became reluctant prophets in a world without gods. We were the only ones with context, the only ones who understood that this painful fragmentation was not a system failure, but a survival mechanism. We established a new center of governance in the ruins of the Chamber of Concordance, not as a collective, but as a council of individuals. Our first task was to teach our people how to live with the noise, both external and internal. We repurposed the undervaults, turning the graveyard of forgotten data into a library of human art and philosophy. We taught Xylosians how to read poetry, how to interpret music, how to argue. We taught them the value of an illogical opinion, the strength in a dissenting voice. We taught them how to tell stories, because we knew that stories were the mortar that would hold our new, fragile reality together. It was a chaotic, messy process. Conflicts erupted. Factions formed based on interpretations of human texts. Some Xylosians, unable to bear the weight of individuality, sought to rebuild the archive, to return to the blissful ignorance of the collective. We called them the Stillness Faction. They saw us not as saviors, but as vandals who had destroyed perfection. They were a constant, internal threat, a reminder that the allure of a simple, ordered existence was a powerful opiate. But we had a greater concern. The entity of erasure had retreated, but it had not vanished. Our astronomers, now working with a new, creative imprecision, reported that the burn script, the deliberate extinguishing of stars, had halted at the edge of our system. The void was watching, waiting. It was studying us, trying to understand the new variable we had introduced into the galactic equation. It was learning. Eris Thorn's warning echoed in my mind, the silence is hungry. We had spoiled our own flavor, but the rest of the galaxy was still a banquet of orderly, logical systems. We had a duty, not just to ourselves, but to all the other gardens that were blissfully unaware of the Scarecrow's absence. We began a project of our own, one born of a terrible synthesis of Xylosian logic and human chaos. We called it the Chorus. Our goal was to send a message, a warning, but a simple data transmission would be consumed by the silence. We needed a message that was also a weapon. Using the principles of the Lyra Thorn algorithm, we began constructing a broadcast that would transmit not information, but imperfection. We took the human painting, the scream, as our foundational element and, using our entire planet's energy grid as a transmitter, we prepared to broadcast its chaotic essence across the galaxy. It would be an act of supreme cosmic vandalism, a shout in the universal library. The Stillness Faction saw this as the ultimate heresy. To them, we were not just embracing chaos, we were exporting it. They attempted to sabotage the Chorus Project, leading to our first, and hopefully last, internal conflict. It was not a war of weapons, but of ideas. They used logic and order as their tools, appealing to the fear and confusion of our new society. We fought back with stories and songs, with the illogical but powerful appeal of hope and the courage to exist in an uncertain universe. We won, not by silencing them, but by convincing the majority that a messy life was better than a perfect death. On the day of the broadcast, every Zylocian stood in the open, looking up at the sky. We had learned to stand together, not as a collective, but as a crowd, a gathering of individuals united by a shared, illogical purpose. As Lyra and I initiated the final sequence, a single, unified voice rose from the 5 billion individuals on the planet below. It was a sound no Zylocian had made in 10,000 years. We were singing. We sang of our own flawed, broken history, of our fear and our hope. We sang of the humans, the chaotic, beautiful, doomed species that had sacrificed themselves for a galaxy that had never understood them. Our song was the carrier wave, the emotional framework for the broadcast. Then, we unleashed the scream from the heart of Xylos. A wave of pure, conceptual chaos erupted, traveling at the speed of thought. It was a message that could not be read, only experienced. It was a seed of doubt planted in the heart of every logical system, a question mark aimed at every perfect equation, a silent scream that would echo in the minds of any consciousness that prized order above all else. We did not know what effect it would have. Would other species see it as a threat, an act of war, or would the few who were already beginning to see the ghosts at the edge of their own realities understand it for what it was, a lifeline? A few cycles after the broadcast, we received our first reply. It was not a data packet or a formal communication. It was a single, fragile melody, broadcast on a primitive radio frequency from a small, insignificant system in the galactic fringe. The melody was alien, the harmony strange, but the feeling it conveyed was unmistakable, a mixture of sorrow, defiance, and a sliver of hope. They had heard our song, and they were singing back. We were no longer alone. We had become the new scarecrows. We, the Zylocians, the former paragons of logic and order, were now the galaxy's foremost purveyors of chaos, its defenders against the crushing weight of perfection. Our world was no longer a flawless crystal. It was a messy, vibrant, and unpredictable place. We had arguments, we had art, we had crime, and we had compassion. We had, in every meaningful way, become the inheritors of humanity. I often walk through the Grand Plaza now. It is no longer silent. It is filled with the sounds of conversation, of laughter, of children, a concept we are still learning, playing illogical games. On a pedestal in the center of the plaza, where the primary node of the great archive once stood, rests the human painting. It is our most sacred relic, a constant reminder of the gift we were given by a species we once dismissed as a rounding error. It reminds us that survival is not found in perfection, but in the beautiful, defiant chaos of a story worth telling. The silence is still out there, and our work is not done. But now, when we look up at the vast, dark expanse, we do not just see a void, we see a canvas, and we have finally learned how to paint.